Okay, I am going to talk today about bird diversity in the Barima Mora Passage. We made a couple of surveys here, and I want to just acknowledge my collaborator on this, Leon Moore, who accompanied me on both of the surveys in the Barima Mora Passage. And let's get into this here. There we go. Also, just quickly, before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge our funders, NRG Holdings, also Annette and Sarah, and all of DMCS for facilitating this. Leslin, who was invaluable assistance in the field with us, kept us fed, made sure that everything was comfortable for us at the station. Smokey was a really great guide, at least for the first survey. He wasn't available for the second, but his knowledge of the forest was really pretty amazing, and really he was a really valuable source of information, and he knew a lot of places to go that we would never have been able to find on our own, and he knew just the forest backwards and forwards. Also, the communities of Smith Creek, Imbatero, and Mora for accommodating us, and Tushao, Anthony Lewis, and his son Aaron, who is an extraordinary crab catcher, for taking us around during our second trip. Okay, we decided to survey birds because birds are very easy to observe and identify. They are really good organisms to survey in a general biodiversity inventory because they provide ecosystem services such as seed dispersal, they control insect pests, and also they're important to local communities. They're a source of food. Some species are hunted, as well as income from trapping and also tourism. So birds, when people come to Guyana and other places in the tropics, places with high bird diversity, they typically want to see birds. Birds are a very important component of ecotourism. And as far as the Barima Mora Passage goes, there's been a lot of avian research in Guyana over the years, but there has not been a lot of information on birds of the Barima Mora Passage area. There have been some random observations here and there reported to eBird, and then in 2002 there was a study by the Smithsonian and University of Kansas who went to the Barima Mora Passage and collected some birds and created a rudimentary bird list of the area. Okay, a lot of this information here is stuff we already know. The Barima Mora Passage is a vast region of intact forest, and its resources sustain all of the surrounding communities. It is part of the largest remaining mangrove ecosystem in Guyana, and of course, mangroves are critically important globally. The goals of our bird surveys were to detect and identify birds, obviously, and document the maximum number of species present during the time that we had, and also just to collect baseline data on diversity and abundance of birds. We were hoping to train local rangers in some of the basics of bird identification, and also to acquaint them with the expectations and the needs of tourists who may be coming to the area in the future to look at birds. We stayed during our time at the Imbatero Marine Research Center, really great facility. It's probably developed quite a bit even since this picture was taken, based on what I've seen on Facebook. It's a really great resource to have. It's a great base for research and has potential to house tourists in the region. And the goals for us, particularly in the second part of the survey work, was to develop a bird list for the center and the surrounding area of Imbatero, and also to identify candidate species for any more targeted research projects in the future. So we did 2 surveys in Imbatero and the surrounding area. One was in October of 2021, and then the other one was about 11 months later in September of 2022. We did surveys by boat and on foot wherever we could. We usually just spent most of our time going up creeks and rivers by boat as far as we could get based on the tides. And then when we encountered places where we could get out and walk around, which was mostly at schools and at farms, we would get out and walk along the dams and see what we could see. We generated the way I recorded most of my bird data is just to record basically every bird we see. We then split those samples into 10 species lists, And then we use those lists to generate diversity estimates using online programs. Also, all of our data were entered into the eBird database run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. So all of the data that we collected during their surveys is available online and can be browsed online. So here are some of the results that we had. We spent quite a bit of time in the field. There's a map of the Barima Mora Passage on the bottom right, and you can see our sampling localities. Each one of those dots is an area where we submitted at least one eBird list. A few of those are just outside of the Barima Mora Passage proper, like in Barima itself. We made a little excursion out to near Winey Point. But for the most part, all of our survey work took place within the boundaries of the Barima Mora Passage itself. And here are our results. So survey one results, we found 187 species in about 9 days. And when we add that to 57 species that were recorded on the previous surveys 20 years prior, we came up with 244 species of birds known to occur in the Barima Mora Passage. Our 10 species list included 7,000 individuals, which is pretty bonkers, and 180 species. That is just the main reason there were so many individual birds is because a few species, notably the orange-winged parrot, were extremely common. So we had, of those 7,086 individuals, over 2,000 of them were orange-winged parrots. That's about 30% of all birds that we recorded were orange-winged parrots. And the most widespread species was the banana quit, which was recorded on 45% of our 10 species lists. That's a very high proportion of 10 species lists, indicating that banana quit is a very abundant bird and is very widely distributed throughout the whole area. When we plugged our data into our online estimators, it came up with an incidence-based estimator of 256 species in the Barima Mora Passage. We thought that might be a little low. So we did another survey 11 months later, and I might add that our survey one during October of 2021, we had sort of some uncharacteristically bad weather. It rained almost the entire time. We actually didn't spend too much time looking at birds. We spent most of our time huddling under shelters, waiting for the rain to stop. And so we didn't get out as much as we could have. After survey two, however, following a run of much, much better weather, we ended up with a total species list of 238 and still 32 species from the previous surveys that we did not detect. So we are now up to 270 species known to occur, documented to occur in the Barima Mora Passage. That's, about 14 species more than we estimated, really our most optimistic estimate based on our season one data. So we surmise that it's hard to put an exact number on the total number of species of birds because there's a lot of species that are very low density, and sometimes the species richness estimators don't account for the just extreme rarity of some bird species. So we estimate that the total richness is in the order of 300 to 350 species in the Barima Mora Passage. Now, that's not quite as high as some places in the interior where there's taller forest and more structurally complex forest, but there are some interesting species there, species that you don't normally find in the interior or other parts of Guyana, which I will get into in a minute. Orange-winged parrot and banana quit remain the most abundant and widespread species. This is the banana quit here. There are quite a few species that are very, very common in Barima Mora Passage. And interestingly, we found a couple of new records for Guyana. So just to demonstrate how little known this area was prior to our surveys, we found belted kingfisher, which from a global perspective is not super significant. It's a North American bird. It's a common kingfisher. It's the dominant kingfisher over most of North America. They do winter as far south as South America, but they were not known to spend the winter in Guyana. So we found several individuals during our first survey. We did not find any in the second survey, but this is our long-awaited first documentation of belted kingfisher in Guyana. The second species is a lot more exciting. This is the black-chested tyrant. This is a very small flycatcher that has a very kind of disjunct distribution in South America and is highly sought after by birdwatchers. And I'll provide a little more detail on that in a moment. I want to shift gears a little bit just to talk about why birdwatchers want to come to Guyana, because the real thrust of our surveys was to assess the region's potential for research and tourism. South America is the most species-rich continent for birds by quite a long shot. It has about a third of the world's bird species, and it also has a lot of unknown species that have not yet been described to science. So there's a lot of species out there that still haven't been described. There's a lot of taxonomic work going on that's splitting species that were previously thought to be one species into multiple species. The most diverse countries are Colombia and Peru. They each have about 1,900 species recorded. Guyana is a little bit less than that. Of course, it's a lot smaller than either Colombia or Peru, but it still has 830 species, and that's more than really occurred in the continental U.S. And the species list for Guyana continues to grow at the rate of 1 or 2 species a year as more bird watchers visit the country. So one interesting feature of South America in terms of birds is that it has multiple areas of endemism. So this is a map showing just some of the what these regions are essentially bounded by rivers. And here on the upper right side, you see what can broadly be considered the Guyana Shield. Most of the endemic species to the region that includes Guyana are found east of the Rio Branco and north of the Amazon, and then also south of the Orinoco in the lowlands. So there's quite a few species that occur in this region and nowhere else. So there's very few species that are endemic to Guyana itself, but there are regional endemics that are found in this area and cannot be found elsewhere in South America. And as I just said, rivers delimit species boundaries in a lot of cases in the South American lowlands. Here's the Rio Negro and the Rio Branco. And again, this is another picture of this, of essentially what I just showed you before, which is the eastern Guianan lowlands. A lot of bird species occupy their entire geographic range in the world, occupies all or part of this area here. And species that are endemic to this area are the species that a lot of visiting bird watchers to Guyana are looking for. And species that have previously been considered to be single species with wide distributions, as more research and genetic work is going on, have been found to be multiple species, in fact, based on genetics, based on vocalizations. And these include things like the Guianan warbling antbird, which was formerly one species and was split into 7, and the Guianan puffbird, which was also once considered a widespread species, and now is known to that the population that is in Guyana is, in fact, an endemic species that's endemic to the Guyana Shield. So what does all of this mean for Guyana and for tourism? Well, what birders want are to see a lot of birds and to see a lot of endemics and rare species. And Guyana has some advantages in this regard. It is a safer and easier country to navigate than Venezuela. I hesitate to even mention Venezuela right now, but I'm just put it out there that I've noticed a sharp uptick in people inquiring to me about birding in Guyana after Venezuela has just become more and more difficult to navigate for birdwatching tourism. Guyana has all of the regional endemics, including highland species, which countries further east lack, because Guyana has a chunk of the Tupui region, the Pacaraimas, which has a lot of species that are endemic. In fact, at the higher elevations in the Pacaraimas, the majority of bird species are endemic to the Tupui highlands. And those are species that are really highly sought by birders. Guyana also has more species than Suriname or French Guiana. So if you're making a trip to this part of the world, it's more cost effective probably to go to Guyana than to go to either of those other two countries, because there's more species of bird there. So you get more species for every dollar that you spend. And Guyana has another advantage in that there's a lot of species that are easier to see in Guyana than they are anywhere else. That includes species with small global populations like the sun parakeet. This is a big draw for people coming to Guyana. The sun parakeets at Carasabai are the easiest sun parakeets to see anywhere. It's just, they're guaranteed, and anybody wanting to check that off their list can make a trip to Carasabai, and they're very well set up with a lot of experienced, knowledgeable local guides to show you the parakeets. And then there's also birds like the harpy eagle, which are low density species on everybody's list. They're not endemic, of course, to the Guianas, but they're probably easier to see in Guyana than anywhere else, because there's a lot of nests that have been found and monitored, and Almost everybody I know who comes to Guyana looking for birds sees at least one harpy. I had a student who came to Guyana and she saw 5 on her first trip. And I know people that have been to South America multiple times and have never seen one. So that is another big draw. And of course, very charismatic birds. You can take a lot of nice pictures of them and show off to your friends. Okay, so I'm sharing this eBird map to show you what the Guyana birding circuit looks like. This is a very typical itinerary for birders, would basically include Georgetown, and then you can see that the shading in these squares represents the amount of species that have been recorded in each little quadrat. So, and you can see that the white areas are areas with no eBird coverage at all. The majority of eBird checklists are submitted by tourists, and you can see that pretty clearly in this graph, where you have some, observations along the coast. That's not surprising, that's where most of the people are. But then, it broadly follows the Letham-Linden Road going down, Iwakrama here in the middle with a large number of species recorded in eBird, and then various locations around the Rupununi where there are several lodges where birders go to find a lot of these endemic species. This is basically where most of the eBird checklists come from and continue to come from. So based on this, I think there's a lot of room to expand the tourism product that Guyana offers as far as birds go. But you need something unique to entice people to make the trip up to Region 1 or to other places that are off of the beaten path. And this is where the Barima Mora Passage comes in. So the mangrove ecosystem, although it might be somewhat less diverse than some of the areas in the interior, it has fewer endemics than some of the areas in the interior, but it has a lot of species that are easier to see there and are also sort of regional specialties that you may not find at all. The other advantage of the Barima Mora Passage is that because it's a relatively open landscape, because the forest is relatively low in stature, it's easier to see birds there. And that's a big draw for tourists, especially people wanting to take photos. They want to be able to get close to birds. They want to see large concentrations of birds, and they want photo opportunities. So I'm just going to go through a few of these birds now. The black-chested tyrant, of course, is kind of the star bird of this area. This is the range map, the previous range map. There's really hardly any records for the Guianas. There's a single record from Western Suriname. I don't know if you can see my pointer in this, but the Western Suriname record is kind of from the middle of the country. In 1986, a bird was misnetted, and that was the only record ever in Suriname. It's never been seen or heard since. And no records from French Guiana, most of northern Brazil. I have seen one of these once in the Orinoco Delta. So when Annette invited me to come survey birds in the Barima Mora Passage, I was thinking that perhaps we could find the black-chested tyrant in this region, because if it's going to be anywhere in Guyana, it's going to be there, because they are certainly in the Orinoco Delta. And we found it on the first day, and it turned out to be actually quite common. We found, particularly in the second survey when we had good weather, we found them every day. We found them around schools. We found them back along creeks. It's close to saying it's a sure bet you're going to find them here than anywhere else. And that's not true anywhere else in the world. This is a bird that people will really travel to see. It's one of the, as it's stated in Birds of the World, it's one of the most sought after birds in Amazonia. This is a bird that is really special, and it's also very flashy. It's a cute little bird. It's got this bright red face. It's got big yellow patches on its wings. And they're fairly tame. They come right into playback, and you can get pretty close to them. So this is really the star of the show. But there's other birds too. The velvet-fronted grackle is another bird that's only found in Region 1. They're very common there. You cannot find this bird anywhere else in Guyana or anywhere in the Guianas at all. And they nest pretty commonly along the creeks. Here's a nest right here. This dark mass that's hanging over the water. We found a lot of these velvet-fronted grackles when we did our surveys, particularly in farms. Sometimes we saw flocks of 50 or so of them. So this is a species that people might come to Guyana to see, because if they go elsewhere in Guyana, they're not going to see it. Here's another one. This is the slender-billed xenops. It might not look like much, but this is a pretty interesting bird, and it's also a very rare bird and typically very hard to see. This bird Where it occurs in the interior, it's often very hard to find because it's relatively rare and it's always way up in the canopy. What I was really surprised to find in the Barima Mora Passage is that this is actually more common than the other species of xenops, which is much considered to be the kind of default species, the plain xenops, which looks a lot like it, but is not a slender-billed xenops. And slender-billed xenops is, a species that even a lot of guides in Guyana have not seen, or not gotten a good look at. These birds will come down to eye level. They're extremely common in the mangroves of the Barima Mora Passage. I was really excited to find them there, and this is something that certainly birders would want to see if they were here. Really hardcore birders would want to see these. And finally, the crimson-hooded manakin. This is a really great photo taken by Leon. We found a lek of these guys. It's a really spectacular, bright black and red manakin with a bright white eye. You can find them displaying all through the Barima Mora Passage, particularly in the second year of our surveys, when the sun was shining almost every day. We went up a creek one day and found over 50 birds. It was display lek after display lek as we went up the river. They were flying across the river in front of us. Some of them were perching in the sun. Really spectacular little bird, and certainly one that, although it is possible to see this bird, at places like Bounty Farm and other places near the coast, there's a ton of them here in the Barima Mora Passage. This is a swamp forest bird. It's a mangrove bird. There aren't many other species of manakins in this area, but this crimson-hooded manakin is very common. Other species, the agami heron, there's a lot of herons along the creeks. The agami herons are very shy. They're always nice to see. They have that big, really imposing bill that they use to spear fish. And agamis are not like other herons where you see them out in the open. They tend to be inside the forest, and they crouch down, and they're very inconspicuous. They just kind of slink away when you approach them. But we saw quite a few agamis in this area, and it was nice to see the number of birds that we saw here. And a couple others. There's the Rufous crabhawk, which of course you can see in Georgetown. It's a regional endemic in the sense that it's only found in mangroves. It's most common in mangroves, and it's really restricted to the northeast coast of South America. So this is a bird that is everywhere. They're right in the middle of Imbitero. You hear them constantly. You see them flying around, and it's a bird that a lot of people come to the Guianas to see. And then the green-throated mango is a hummingbird that is present in Georgetown and other areas of the coast, but it's usually outnumbered by a related species called the black-throated mango. Green-throated mango is actually the default mango in this region. It's much more common than the black-throated mango, and so that's another species that birders would want to see if they came there. And then finally, there's a lot of, as I said, a lot of big concentrations of birds. So we had several species of birds that were abundant in our 10 species samples. The scarlet ibis was one of those. We saw hundreds, if not thousands, of scarlet ibises. Certainly large flocks every day. Of course, you can go see these, particularly in the low light of the afternoon. You get these mangroves that are festooned with all these birds going to roost. Really spectacular sight, and something that even a non-bird watcher would be really impressed by, because these birds really just glow in the late afternoon light, and are really a spectacular sight. And the other thing is parrots. I mentioned that we had almost 30% of the individual birds that we detected on our first survey were orange-winged parrots. A large number of parrots were known to roost at the confluence of the Aruca and Barima rivers, near the Aruca Primary School. And we went there the first year, and it was a spectacular sight. We sat out in the river and watched these birds come in to roost, and we estimated that there were maybe a couple thousand birds. When we went back a year later, the roost had moved a little bit, and we realized that we had massively undercounted the birds the first time. I estimated in our second visit that there were probably about 20,000 parrots, not 2,000. And I actually think that's a low number. I think it's the actual number of birds is probably closer to 30,000 birds in one spot. And that's just one roost. We were standing at a spot, and these birds were coming in at the rate of at least 500 per minute overhead for close to an hour. So there are a lot of birds coming in here, and you know, the sound of it all, and the sight of these birds just flying all over, it is really impressive, and it makes a real impression on people. So you can, you know, sit out in your boat, you can sip your drinks and watch the parrots fly in, get beautiful light on them. And it's just a really nice thing to be able to do, and not something that you can really do elsewhere in Guyana. So, in summary, you know, the Barima Mora Passage, of course, has a diverse bird community, like almost everywhere in Guyana does. Birds are easy to see there, which is a big draw for birding tourism, because not all people who come to Guyana and are interested in looking at birds are birders. They're simply tourists who want to see nice birds and see big birds and see birds up close. Big concentrations of birds are always a big draw for people. And this station that's being developed in Mbatero is a really valuable resource to accommodate tourists, as well as researchers who might want to do research projects in some of these birds, especially parrots. And some of the linkages in Region 1, you know, we could combine birding tourism with other forms of tourism. Local culture, particularly agriculture. I myself was fascinated by the agricultural systems along the rivers, the way that they've cut these canals mostly by hand to grow a variety of crops. It was really interesting to me to walk around these farms and to see the diversity of food that's being produced in these areas. And also the crabbing is also a pretty impressive thing to watch. First of all, the crabs themselves are enormous. They're really impressive to see. And it's awesome to watch the guys just jump out of the boats and dive into the mud and grab these things. I would never do it. And, you know, I was thinking about this and thinking that, you know, well, Mbatero is pretty close to Shell Beach. Maybe we could develop some kind of tourism product that combines sea turtles and birding and other aspects of local culture. So I think you could almost develop a new tourism circuit in Guyana based in Region 1 and Region 2 that would showcase all of this natural and cultural diversity. And finally, it's really critical that we continue to build capacity. We created a poster on the birds of the Barima Mora Passage. That poster is now up in a bunch of primary schools around the region, and we are also working along with Leon, of course, to improve the skill set of aspiring bird guides, to teach them more about bird ID and how to document and record birds. So we would love to continue that work with Mbatero and the surrounding communities. Okay, that's all I have for now. I'm happy to take any questions. I have a couple Instagram links here. Barima Mora Passage has an Instagram, and my own Instagram is here. I don't update it as often as I should, but I hope to do so more in the coming months. And if you're interested in contacting me directly, there's my email there.